So this is the first installment of our brand new strand of events, the Disruptor Sessions. So at each session, we'll learn about a big, bold idea that can help address our climate emergency and discuss how it can be applied to the advertising industry. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome Erinch Sahan from the Doughnut Economics Action Lab to this first session. So yeah, welcome Erinch. So a bit of background on Doughnut Economics, I'm sure he'll talk about it as well, but it all started with a book, which I cannot recommend enough. If you haven't read it, read it, it's amazing. So it was written by self-titled renegade economist Kate Raworth and is nothing short of revolutionary. She redesigns a new model for economics based around the doughnut, which values human well-being and advocates for a regenerative and distributive economy as an alternative to the current norm, which is an economy governed by infinite GDP growth, which is increasingly recognised as being odds with a sustainable, thriving future. Doughnut Economics Action Lab is a non-profit that has since been formed to move the doughnut from concept into real-world action. So Erinch is with us. He's the business and enterprise lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Prior to that, he was the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization and previously spent 7 years at Oxfam leading campaign initiatives and founded Oxfam's Future of Business Initiative. He's also sort of danced into the more corporate circles like many of us, working at Procter & Gamble as a market strategy manager. He's also a board member of the Social Enterprise World Forum and teaches sustainable value chains at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where coincidentally, Jonathan also tutors on a course and Lisa is an assessor. They've also got lots of great sustainability courses and are well worth checking out. So we're in good hands. So what can we expect from the session? So Erinch will be introducing Doughnut Economics and then explore challenges, ideas and models for achieving the needed transformations in business to help humanity move into the doughnut. So he'll be talking for around half an hour and then we'll open up to a Q&A. And then in the last 30 minutes of the session, so from 6 p.m. till 6:30, we'll be hosting it from PD and we're spending a bit of time reflecting on the Q&A and thinking about how this applies to our world of marketing, comms and advertising. So finally, a tiny bit of housekeeping. So if you could keep yourselves on mute, that would be awesome. There's a lot of you. And then for the Q&A section, so we've got a bit of a tried and tested format. So because there's so many of you, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions throughout the session, I'm going to be sharing a Google Doc right now, which I hope you can all access. Dropping it into the meeting chat now. So that's in the chat. So throughout the talk and the Q&A, if you could just drop your questions you have in there, and then Lisa, our glamorous assistant, will be clustering them behind the scenes, and then we'll repeat them back to Erinch in the Q&A section. So it just means we can get to as many questions as possible. And it just really helps us out. So if you're having problems accessing that, just let us know in the chat. Right. Oh, and also grab a pen and paper. Jonathan asked me to ask you to do that. So if you haven't got a pen and paper, go and get a pen and paper. Right, enough from me. Take it away, Erinch.
Oh, thank you, Amy. Really delighted to be with you all. I feel like this is a grouping that has got a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. We want to channel some of that, bring in a level of sort of ambition into the way we're going to transform our economies and channel the very unique nature, I think, of creativity, ambition and innovation that comes out of advertising communications that I'm very well aware of in the various interactions I've had with your industry. So I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes. It might spill over to 30 minutes, depending on how excited I get with the content that I'm sharing with you all. So I'm sharing my screen now, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion. In particular, looking forward to the questions and comments and reactions that are maybe a little bit more challenging, because just to warn you, I think this is going to be a little bit of an edgy discussion. This is hopefully going to be a little bit edgy. It's going to hopefully trigger some uncomfortable discussions as well as some comfortable ones, and some realizations around, wow, how are we going to crack this nut? How are we going to help humanity into the doughnut? But first, I need to explain to you, I think some of you probably have read the book or watched the TED talk from my colleague Kate Raworth, who's the author of the book and the inventor of the concept of Doughnut Economics. Many of you will know about it, some of you might not, but let me just begin by introducing what it is and why we are talking about it. So firstly, the 21st century, it's been a century that has begun with various crises. We've had a financial meltdown, which seems so long ago, but also fundamentally transformed so many people's lives in negative ways. And we've been seeing these climate breakdowns around the world. Sydney, the town that I grew up in, originally Turkish, but grew up in Sydney, where we've been seeing the impacts of climate change time and time again and increased prevalence. And the COVID lockdown, which reminded us of some of the impacts on our health of encroaching upon nature and the way we need to respect and work within nature's own system. So from meltdown to breakdown to lockdown, this century of crisis is reminding us we need to transform and we need to adapt. And in response, what we do is propose a donut that is a compass for human prosperity. There are two concentric circles that are critical here. The outer concentric circle, the ecological ceiling, it comes from the work of Earth system scientists that have told us that we've got 9 critical dimensions to planetary boundaries that we must not transgress. We must stay within the limits of our living planet. We also need to add to this, and this is where Kate Raworth's work was critical, an aspect of a social flaw, because we cannot just decrease and contract our economies to a point where we are no longer providing life's essentials. We need our economies to provide income and work and housing and food and energy and all the social critical things that we need to thrive as human beings. And it's in that space between that outer boundary, the ecological ceiling, and the inner boundary, the social foundation, that lives the safe and just space for humanity. Now, many people say to me when I present this, or my colleagues present this, that this feels a bit like a statement of fact, in some ways a statement of the obvious. Who would disagree with the fact that our planet does have boundaries? We cannot push it beyond its carrying capacity. And who would disagree with the fact that, yes, we need life's essentials for everybody on it, for stable societies, and just for the ethics of our own species to thrive, we need to provide life's essentials. So both of those boundaries hopefully feel like things that are difficult to disagree with, that these are inherent in the goals that we are all pursuing. But then we need to ask ourselves, how are we doing based on this? And this is the result. This is the outcome. We are in significant overshoot on many of our planet's boundaries. In fact, the situation looks even worse than this, because the two grays there that you see on the outer concentric circle, the chemical pollution, air pollution, these are two aspects that at a global level, scientists haven't figured out how to quantify. But chemical pollution, recently they did, and that is also in overshoot, and we'll be publishing a new version of the donut based on that recent science. We're also in shortfall on life's essentials for about 1 billion people on this planet who are going to bed hungry every day. So we are unable to provide life's essentials while overusing the planet's resources and transgressing its boundaries. Something has gone wrong. The situation can also be looked at a national level. So how are we doing at a country level? Well, we are in significant overshoot in all of the countries that claim to be high income countries. The way we are meeting the needs of most people in places like the UK or US, and increasingly in what are deemed middle income countries like China, India, Brazil, well, we're doing that by unsustainably using the Earth's boundaries and transgressing its boundaries. It's not a model of development, of economic development, that is replicable or could be continued for very long. The opposite is kind of true in the global south. Actually, countries like Malawi are using far less than their fair share of the planet's boundaries, but also under-delivering even more significantly on life's essentials for their people. When we look at this picture, what we see is that every country, every nation must transform. We are all developing countries now. None of us are at a point where we can say, this is the model of economic development. This is our economic system that we now continue for the rest of time. The situation is the same, no matter who we flip into this. There is no country that's in the donut. The country that actually comes closest is Costa Rica, but it too is not quite in the donut. So overall, the picture that is coming out of this is a selfie of humanity that is a little bit embarrassing, but significantly alarming, and tells us that we must transform. So in preparation for this talk, I thought about, well, what do I take from the work of my colleague, Kate Rayworth, who's been unpacking these ideas and thinking through how do we move towards an economy that is within the donut? And I thought about the advertising space in industry. And I wanted to just share a couple of quotes from the book that I think are pertinent and challenge us to think through the bigger transformations we could drive together. The first is this quote, which reminds us that despite being far richer than the kings of years ago, that we are still too easily trapped on a treadmill of consumerism, continually searching for identity, connection, and self-transformation through the things that we buy, forever chasing the promise of that next purchase. The second quote I want to pull out from here is from a similar part of the book, where reversing consumerism's financial and cultural dominance in public and private life is set to be one of the 21st century's most gripping psychological dramas. Now, you're all participants in that psychological drama, that gripping psychological drama, and you're all able to shape and design the way that it unfolds, the way history will unfold in terms of the kind of society, the kind of lifestyles that we are generating, shaping significantly through advertising professionals, their genius and their innovation and creativity. So let's go into the content of this a little bit. What does it look like? What is it that is causing this huge overshoot on planetary boundaries and shortfall on life's essentials? Well, a part of it is this take, make, use, lose model of linear production that we have. So the model of production that essentially takes from Earth, makes things, uses things, then loses things. And of course, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren are going to turn to us one day and say, did you know about this? Did you promote this? Did you drive this? Were you part of this way of operating that clearly was degenerative and damaging in a way that is taking from future generations a stable Earth system? But of course, we're beginning to see innovations that help us move away from this and start to create hope in what it could look like. And that future can work with and within the cycles of the living world. And here I'm showing just a short diagram on the right-hand side of that is taking from the circular economy, which is essentially saying, how do we replicate some of the ideas from nature and from Earth, which is making sure that actually there is no waste in nature. There is no waste in the way that our planet, our living planet operates. The output of one thing is an input to another, and it circulates through. There are two important loops here on the left-hand side, those biological materials, those natural, for instance, natural fibers in fashion, or things that are coming from agriculture, things that are grown that are biological. Well, they go into regenerative loops, so they get reused, go back into nature and keep driving those nutrients back through. On the right-hand side are those technical things, the things that we've created as humans. Well, those technical materials can be restored, it can be repaired, it can go into their own loops that make sure that they minimize and eventually eliminate waste from the system. So there is a bit of a journey that's happening here. But let's have a quick look at what we mean by this. What does it look like in reality? Some of you might have heard of the company and brand Fairphone, which has created an open modular design. It's created a model of product design that means that it is actively working against built-in obsolescence. It is actively saying, actually, we want our products to survive longer. We want them to be much more useful. We want them to be repairable. There's an aspect of being regenerative that is built into the core of the purpose of Fairphone. It's got a bunch of social credentials as well. But what is critical here is that it is trying to eliminate waste. And maybe at a core business level, it is able to buck the trend of the rest of this industry, which is focused on how do I sell more stuff? How do I sell new stuff? And clearly this model of phone design has been going on for a decade. And the rest of the industry has looked at it and said, no, actually, I make more money by selling a phone that's going to break down and need to be replaced in 3 years' time. And that model has continued now for a long time without being embraced. So the second is the example from Interface Carpets, where they've looked to nature and to forests and said, well, if our factory was not here, what would the wildland be doing? How would nature and the forest here be behaving? Well, the answer is it would be sequestering carbon. It will be cleaning the groundwater. It would be cleaning the air. It would be putting nutrients back into the soil for other natural organisms to use. That forest would also be cooling the environment on hot summer days for local species. If you think about the way that the Earth systems work, they create benefits. They don't go towards minimizing or reducing harm. So if you take that perspective of how do we replicate some of the positives that nature creates, then suddenly you can just start to design production, manufacturing, and the broader aspects of operations of business to replicate and mimic some of those. By the way, that comes from the concept of biomimicry, which is a phenomenal field that has been taking off recently. Another example is Sanergy toilets in Kenya, in the slums of Nairobi, providing accessible and affordable toilets for people at the lowest level of income. The output of those toilets is going into becoming safe fertilizer that is used for farming in the region, providing food and other opportunities for people in that area. And lastly, I want to share the example of Houdini. It's a fascinating company based in Sweden. They've created a circular model of product design here. What's interesting is not just the fact that they've been able to separate the natural fibers from the synthetic fibers and create loops around that. Fantastic aspects of their research and development that has created an interesting product. What's interesting about Houdini is they've made all of their product designs open source. So they've said to the rest of their industry, we're not here to grow our sales and grow our market share infinitely. Actually, the problem that we want to be a part of solving is the transformation of this sector, transformation of fashion. And if that is our core purpose, then why would we hold on to our intellectual property in a territorial way? We would actually share this, but take this, guys, competitors, others, peers in the industry, take it, build on it, and make better, more effective circular products of your own. So those are some examples from the ecological space that we find inspiring. They give us a snippet of what the future could look like in terms of regenerative practices. But we also need to have a look at the social side. And some of you might have noticed the report that came out last week around the World Economic Forum in Davos that showed that 2/3 of newly created wealth over the last couple of years has gone to the richest 1%. There's a spiraling level of inequality that is happening. Value and opportunity is captured in the hands of far few people. And instead, we need to be deliberate about the way we design our economies and the way we design our businesses and financial structures to share opportunity and value much more equitably with all who co-create it. So these are big words, but what does it mean for it to be distributive by design? And a few examples come to mind. Some of them I know personally and very intimately. Examples like creative handicrafts, led by my good friend, Johnny Joseph, who's sitting there, who's the CEO of a fashion factory in Mumbai in India. Now that fashion factory is co-owned by the women workers, the marginalized women workers who have been employed, supported, trained, and become part owners of their business. The business, when it succeeds, a much broader level of the most marginalized sections of society in India get a disproportionate part of that value. It's sort of the opposite of some of the trickle-down economics at an enterprise level. Another example is Richer Sounds. It's a business that converted from being a very successful founder-led business to an employee-owned business. As the founder began to retire, he realized that actually the way to safeguard the legacy of the business was to bring into the deep design of it, the ownership model of it, the ideals of empowerment of its own employees as well as the local community, and making that a priority through the deep structural aspects of the business. Others like Fairbnb, an example of a platform cooperative that is focused on communities benefiting from tourism. So half the revenue goes back into community groups for them to use, but also they promote slow tourism. And they want to make sure that those that have the highest aggregation of land holdings don't use their platform to increase their own wealth. So a model that is designed around creating a distributive impact. And lastly, Lush, a business that has deliberately said, hey, we benefit from having paying a fair tax, because we are part of a society that relies on social services, that relies on education, that relies on healthcare, that relies on training of our workforce, that relies on the stable infrastructure and everything else. Like we built our business on the back of a society that's functional. So we need to pay our fair tax. We're not going to minimize our tax bill. An incredibly radical idea in the business world. If you're aware of the practices of most companies, which see tax as a cost to be minimized, but that certainly is an example of being distributive in its practices. Now, a lot of these ideas emerge across different parts of the business world, but I think that it would be quite clear to many of you, this is not the mainstream of business. This is very much marginal currently. This is not the way businesses generally operate. So we've been working with companies over the last year, 300 businesses around the world over the last year, to figure out how do we start to generate these transformative ideas. Some of the ones I mentioned to you, factories behaving like forests, modular product design, moving towards employee ownership or artisan worker ownership models, or different ways of being open source in the design of the business. Well, some of the ways that we've come up with, and I think this could be helpful if you're ever in a conversation around this in your business with your clients or others that you engage with, is if we visualize that thriving future economy, that thriving future economy that is within the donut, that is within the planet's boundaries and meeting the essentials of life for everybody on it. Well, that economy kind of has to come, right? Like it's not optional. If we don't get there, we're going to degrade our ability to live on this planet in a safe way. And we're going to get to a point where actually the systems, the Earth systems, start to crumble, start to flicker, and stop functioning in a way that makes it safely inhabitable for us. So if we have to get to this inevitable future thriving economy, then we need to consider ourselves as part of it. We need to think about, how do we belong to that future economy as an industry, as a business, as a client, as a neighboring business that what would it take for you to belong to that future economy that is regenerative, that is distributive? And in doing so, what have you started doing and what have you stopped doing? So maybe you stop working in certain sectors, or maybe you discontinue certain product lines where the harm can be reduced, but never really get to a point where it is regenerative or distributive. Maybe you stop working with particular clients. Maybe you start working instead in a very different way, different sort of structures of fees, different models of sharing value or prioritizing messages. It could be a whole host of things. We leave it to you. We're not prescriptive or suggestive about exactly what that entails. But the big questions are there, and it takes a little bit of discomfort to push through to start to identify these. And to help that along, we've been asking people to envision what they might hear from activists. So if you were to go and talk to Extinction Rebellion, what would they say around what is needed here, around the transformation to belong to that future economy? What would junior colleagues say? Increasingly, younger people have a high level of climate anxiety, for instance. They might have bigger ideas about the transformation needed. Often technical experts, people in research and development, people who are sort of subject matter experts who might not be in decision-making rooms on marketing or on broader strategy. They might have ideas, or industry leaders, including some of the ones I mentioned earlier. What would they be putting on the table as ideas for you to pursue? But we don't stop there, because I think here we get to a point where some of the ideas begin to stretch. But we need to question ourselves a little bit further. We need to start asking, what would different voices say if they were around the table? And of course, there are some that are more proximate to us, that are closer to us, like our employees, local communities, customers, those that we maybe can envision, we can interact with because they're not so far in terms of distance. Let's go a step deeper. What would the workers in the supply chain say if they had a voice in the room, if they were represented on a board? What about nearby forests and rivers, or the air and the soil, the living planet? What if they truly had a voice into this? And we're beginning to see actually models where there is innovation in bringing that voice in. I mean, Faith in Nature recently changed its board structure so that Lawyers for Nature has a voting seat on its board. We're beginning to see models of bringing in aspects of the planet's voice into the governance and the board structure of companies. And of course, and maybe most critically, the voice that we need to bring into the room is future generations. If you were a future generation, what would you react to some of the ideas that are being put on the table? Some of the ideas maybe that seem viable or possible, so we need to do step-by-step incremental things. How would the future generations react to our excuses for not making this transition, not making this transformation? And that sort of allows you to sort of bring up, I think, put the bigger ideas on the table. Now, what we found in pursuing this is that the companies that were stuck in that regenerative divisive model and the industries that were stuck there, well, they had a bunch of things. They had outdated processes, whether it's decision-making or ways of doing research or ways of prioritizing ideas. They had rigid financial targets. Time and time again, we saw the rigidity of financial targets holding back ideas. And I'm going to present a couple of examples in a minute. Short-term thinking was prevalent, as well as a culture of hierarchy. And on the other side, what we saw from the companies that were pushing the boundaries, that were putting big ideas on the table, well, they suspended practicality. They weren't looking at, short-term commercial results or what seems viable or possible or plausible today. They were saying, let's put the big ideas on the table anyway. Let's not make excuses for why we shouldn't even explore this as a possibility. They were bringing in broader perspectives. They were bringing in perspectives such as the ones I just listed from across the stakeholder groups that they impact. They were bringing in long-term thinking and really fostering a culture of courage, so that those that were bringing up those challenging ideas, maybe pressing companies to move faster and more ambitiously on those ideas, they were encouraged rather than shot down or even discouraged from pursuing them. So those were some of those ideas. But also, we want to pause to just reflect that this aspect of putting big ideas on the table and looking at the deep design of companies and how they can really draw this out, well, that's one of many ways that change is going to happen here. And I want to sort of pause to reflect. There are many complementary transformation strategies going on. There's a lot of people working on exerting public pressure, whether that's collective organizing from consumers or activists or workers, or it might be investors sort of creating pressure, or regulations that are coming through from governments. There's a lot of people working on enlightened leadership and saying, look, let's just get people to have a cultural awakening at the top of businesses so that they pursue the ideas that we need from them. There's people working on setting targets and metrics and measuring goals for companies individually to pursue something. And there's people that are working on business case and saying, actually, in the long run, you'll make more money, your returns will be better, and overall, there's a business case for doing the right thing here. These are all fantastic. But Doughnut Economics focuses on something else. And what it focuses on is the deep design of business. Where we see things is that, look, the way a lot of institutions, the broader economy, the broader society, they can often pursue regenerative distributive ideas, whether it's the commons or communities or NGOs or charities. Their design tends to enable them to do this. But when we look at the business world that is designed to maximize margins, maximize dividends, maximize sales and market share, well, they only are able to do regenerative and distributive things when it is in overlap with maximizing margins and dividends. There's a flaw here. We've designed companies so that it's exceptional to do the right thing. But what if we were to redesign companies to unlock regenerative and distributive possibilities? What if we said that is at the core? That's the institutional design. I mean, the design of companies is a choice. It's actually a very recent choice. In the 20th century, a whole bunch of financial institutions, financial instruments, and corporate structures became a norm. And it was during a period where we didn't appreciate the limits of our planet. We didn't appreciate how difficult it's going to be to lift everybody to life's essentials on our planet. So it was created for a different era. And now we're in an era where we can see the donut, we can see the overshoot, we can see the shortfall, and we need to redesign quite fundamentally the structures of business. So here I'm going to move to the last part, which helps us sort of unlock what that could look like. And to do so, I'm going to give 3 examples that of businesses and business leaders I worked with and colleagues of mine have worked with or came up to us in talks and workshops and confided in us some of what is holding them back. The first one is a senior executive from a major footwear brand. I mean, it's a brand that all of you have heard of, and it's a brand that is doing phenomenally well globally. Well, it's a company where an idea was presented to create a new shoe that would be expandable so that parents in lower income communities can buy a shoe for their children, and that's going to be better for them long term at an affordable price. And because it's expandable, they buy it once and it lasts longer. So there's an amazing social impact as well as an amazing ecological impact. But when they crunch numbers, they realize that while it's profitable, it didn't hit their usual margin requirements. So the idea and the project, the initiative was dropped. We also came across senior executives from a beauty brand who realized that they have this huge net zero ambition. And the only way they're going to realistically hit that is if they moved away from single-use packaging, essentially go into the refillable model. Now, doing so is going to lead to or require them to invest into marketing and consumer engagement that had a payback period that was a little bit too long. So that investment, while it was going to help them become a market leader in this, it was going to help them build a brand around, a new circular economy that they were driving at the heart of. While that was desirable, had a value to it, then, well, actually the capital expenditure needed into the business long-term wasn't justified. And lastly, a company that from the fashion industry that came up to us, a senior executive that kind of told us about how there's been a push to have regenerative clothing, but absolutely no give on the requirement to have the usual 15% profit margins. That limitation, that design limitation of the business that enforced those financial parameters, held back all of these ideas. Now, the point here is that that's a choice. And can you imagine all of the ideas that are possible that don't get pursued, that get shut down, that don't even get talked about, generated, or explored because they're not meeting the requirements of the institutional design of the business? And that means that it's incumbent on us to start asking the bigger question. How do we move away from that 20th century model of business, which is about how much value can we extract through this enterprise, and move towards a 21st century model of how many benefits can we generate through this enterprise? Now, to explore this, we leaned heavily on the work of author and theorist Marjorie Kelly to focus on this framework of purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. And to quote the work of, or the words of George Box here, just to say that every model is wrong, but some are useful. And we hope this is a useful way or a useful model to explore the deep design of a business and to think through how can business be redesigned to pursue 21st century goals. Now, to pursue that, what we did is create essentially a toolkit. So if you're interested in actually going on through the journey I'm about to go through, if you go to doughuneconomics.org, we have a tool here that any business can use internally. You could use it with your clients as well if you're working directly with businesses. It takes 4 or 5 hours to do the full workshop. We're creating sort of a taster tool as well to do a shorter version. But if you're interested in what I'm about to present, then do check that out at doughuneconomics.org. If you go to the tools page, you'll find it. If you go to the thematic business and enterprise page, you'll find it's in multiple parts of the website. So with that in mind, a quick run through, a tour of what this is, which is to ask firstly the question of purpose. Why does the business exist? What does it serve in the world? And how does that purpose manifest in its operations, products, and services? And here it's good to contrast some of the intrinsic aspects of different business models. So if you look at fast fashion, intrinsically, it's about producing as much as possible, as cheap as possible, as quickly as possible. The parameters of that business model severely limit what is possible as a purpose of that business. But if we look at examples like that I've known intimately, like Manos del Uruguay, based in Uruguay, creating high value, slow fashion items, that is co-owned by 12 different women producer organizations spread across Uruguay. They've been in operation since 1968. They're producing products that are sold on Champs-Élysées and Madison Avenue. But what is critical here is that their model of ownership and governance means that its purpose genuinely is to create social and ecological benefit for the communities that are producing these products in marginalized parts of Uruguay. If we look at the next layer, which is networks, this is all about relationships, the relationships with customers, with suppliers, with staff, governments, communities, and commercial partners. Now, are these commodified relationships? Are these relationships where costs are minimized, risks are minimized for each party, and everything is negotiated usually on a short-term basis? Are they collaborative partnerships, like the example of El Puente, where When the COVID pandemic hit, they actually doubled down on their support for their supply chain. Now, that's a model that is co-owned and co-governed with its supply chain producers, as well as its own workers in Germany, as well as different community groups, a model of multi-stakeholder governance. So if you go to their board, all those groups are represented, for instance. Another example is governance, or the layer is governance. And what is governance in service of? Is it in service of finance or in service of purpose? It's a fascinating example of River Simple, a hydrogen car company. Regardless of what you think of the technology or the product, what's interesting is this governance model. Its board has got different stakeholders for which there are stewards that sit on their board. So they are there to represent the interests and focus on the interests and perspective of the environment, or of staff, or of the neighbors of the business, or the users, end users, or the investors of the company. So it's able to bring those different perspectives into the boardroom. Then we move to ownership. And of course, a lot of these overlap, but the example here to really that really jumped out at me, and of course, many of you would have seen the Patagonia story of a few months ago, where Earth became their only shareholder. What's interesting to dig a little bit beneath that, what does it structurally look like from an ownership perspective? Now, what Patagonia did is really build on a model that's been around for over a century called steward ownership. That's huge in Germany, big in Denmark, places where actually what they recognize is the ownership structure is fundamental to what's possible for a business to pursue. What Patagonia did, like the other steward ownership organizations and businesses, is to say we've got two different share classes. We have a share class that collects all of the dividends but has no voting rights. We have another share class that has all of the voting rights, collects no dividends. So it's separated power and money. And those with the power, with the voting rights, actually have no incentive to maximize returns. They're there as stewards of the purpose of the business. Those that want to increase the dividends and get a higher surplus or profit, well, actually, they don't have an ability to influence the company. So that separation of share classes and a new innovative ownership model means that decision makers in a company can be liberated to pursue things that are commercially viable while pursuing the core purpose of the business. And last but not least, finance and the financial structures behind a business. What are the margin expectations, dividend requirements? Where do profits go? What's considered a fair return for investors? What are the exit expectations of owners and the investors within the business? How is it able to structure its financial parameters to pursue its purpose? An example here is a partnership I worked as a part of for a while between the Body Shop and Plastics for Change. Now, it enabled the waste pickers in India that were bringing in the plastics to be treated with far greater dignity and support. In fact, we were able to bring fair trade principles into that model. But what was critical that enabled the Body Shop to do something that had never been done before is their financial parameters within the Body Shop's community trade program could flex to enable this partnership and enable this focus. So to wrap up, I'd like to sort of just summarize, what are we saying here? What we're saying is that there are benefits to redesigning business, redesigning entire industries. And I reflect here on the advertising industry. And I've got a question at the end of this in my next and last slide. But to remind us, what are the benefits? Well, you might want to actually redesign so that the processes of a company, for instance, whether it's a product design part of it, or a sales function, or a marketing function, or a client management function, well, how are those processes aligned with the purpose of the business? And critically, how are the partnerships and the stakeholders enabled to be a true partner and engaged in the deep design of the business? For instance, to achieve supply chain security. How are we channeling investment and using the profits of a company to invest into transformative ideas? And how are we locking in the legacy and the purpose of a business, protecting it over the long term, whether it's generational shift or hostile takeovers? How do we retain the business's focus on those social and ecological goals? But perhaps most importantly, we're here because we want to redesign to make sure that we are becoming regenerative and distributive by design as people involved in business across the world. So I threw a lot at you there around how do we go from the donut all the way through the big ideas that will transform our economy to the way that businesses can be redesigned to unlock and enable those ideas. But I leave here with two questions that might inform some of our discussion and the broader discussions that you might have, which is, what might we aspire to besides products? And And this is really going to the core of where the advertising industry has impacts. Forget about your own operations. Forget about the way sets and filming works. Your real power is in the way that you shape lifestyles. That is your core reality of the way you impact the world and the donut. So let's focus there. What might we aspire to besides products, and what role can the advertising industry and professionals, these amazing, innovative, creative professionals, play in that transition away from that toxic 20th century consumerism that has led us down this path? And secondly, can the advertising industry itself evolve to be regenerative and distributive by design, focusing on its role in creating the world we need to see? And it's about going beyond applying the same skills to just green products or a bit more green products, but going towards what is your transformational agenda? How are you going to disrupt business as usual here and play a huge, ambitious role in evolving the sector and the broader economy? So I'm going to leave this up. Not sure if you want me to stop sharing here, Amy, but that's it. That's the end of my slides, and it was a pleasure to have all of you in the audience.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think you'd leave it up for a moment, but yeah, then maybe when Lisa starts repeating the questions back, we could probably take it down, and so we can see people in the room. So Lisa, I believe you've been working behind the scenes, clustering questions.
I have. I don't know whether Jonathan was just going to do a quick reflection first, and then I'll some of the questions.
Yeah. I mean, Erinch, that was amazing. So thank you. I sort of read the book, read most of the book, and yeah, I think it's just such a fantastic kind of concept, the donut. I mean, when you read the book, I think what's interesting. So just to kind of just some thoughts. Just it's so simple. It's a donut, and I think there's just something incredibly, and that's how the book starts. The book starts by telling you how important, how we connect as humans to images, and I just think that's just a creative expression of an idea through the visual icon of a donut. Is just brilliant. It's so clever, and it's like once you've seen it, you can't forget it. I think that's fantastic. Just some other reflections. I think secondly, it's also really validating for us as purpose disruptors. I think one of our kind of idea is that the advertising industry needs to go through a kind of a transformation of itself to transition to be in service of a thriving future, as Lisa said. And I think that what you've articulated here is a really clear understanding for all of us, the kind of changes that need to occur through the industry, that needs to undergo in order to make the transition. So thank you. There's so much in there that allows people to grasp onto ideas that can perhaps provide stimulus and thoughts for what can be done. I think also just a kind of a reflection it's so interesting that the vast majority, I think all of the examples you gave were manufacturing. You talked about kind of clothing, perfume, footwear, etc. And so I think, again, you talked about, the need to kind of, can we unlock transformative ideas, suspend practicality, adopt broad perspectives, long-term thinking, and the culture of courage. Like it's a wide open, it's like a virgin space, I think, to be able to think about what a regenerative service company would be, not a product company. And so I think that this is such a gift for the advertising industry to think about. It's like first mover advantage. What would it be to be regenerative, as you said? And as you were speaking, it reminded me, for the older people in the room, there's an agency called St. Luke's. And I just remembered reading this book called Open Minds by one of the founders, Andy Law. And it's basically, in some ways, talking exactly what you're saying. Because I think some people will think this is impossible for an agency to do this. And yet St. Luke's did it back in the 80s. And I'm just going to read, it says on the back, 10 ways to create a revolution in your company, right? And they were a cooperative. It's distributed by design. And the first things they say are, ask all your employees, ask yourself what you want out of life. Ask yourself what really matters to you. 3, give all your work clothes to Oxfam and wear what you feel is really you. And number 4, talk to people, even those you don't like, about 1 and 2, you should be feeling very uncomfortable now. You may feel sick. This is normal. So this is almost like back in the 80s, like there's like what you're suggesting is not new to the industry. There's almost like a memory of it being done before. So that's really inspiring to know that the industry has responded positively in the sort of way that you are already, history is repeating itself in a way, and the industry has already done it before, which is fantastic. And I just love the idea of the different voices. Like when I worked in advertising, the only voice in the room was the voice of the client and the voice of the consumer. And this idea of even the voice of the citizen, which is what some of Lisa led in terms of the good life work and what citizens actually want now, which isn't more stuff, and also the voice of nature, and I saw in the chat, braiding sweetgrass, and 7 generations time. So I just think there's just so much that you've shared with us that connects to what we're doing as Purpose Disruptors, our belief system, and also is a reflection of what's already happened in the industry. That's all gives kind of a wonderful possibility for this to become alive in the industry today and in the coming kind of months and years. So thank you so much. Really, really wonderful. And so just after that reflection, what we wanted to do for everybody on the call is to just to have a...
I was just going to say, sorry, Jonathan, because we've only got Erinch for another until 6, so I'm conscious.
Oh, okay, sure.
I can stay an extra 10 minutes. If
okay, amazing. So yeah, I was just thinking it would be whether I'm just conscious that we might want to get to some of the people's questions. Are
there questions are there lots of questions in the document?
Yes.
Yeah,
let's go. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. Thank you for your questions. I'm going to go with the most punchy ones because that's where the fun is. So, Erinch, thinking about the future economy. So, do advertising and marketing belong in the future economy? If not, what might these roles transform into? From Robert Parry.
It's a really great question. I mean, I don't have a clear answer to that. It depends on what we think advertising and marketing is. What its role is, what its goals are, what its objectives are, what function does it serve in the world. There probably is a function in getting information to people so they can make healthy choices about how they consume. And if we define what advertising and what marketing is in format that feels like it belongs to a regenerative and distributive economy, then yes. I'm not sure the advertising and marketing industry I used to be a part of 15 years ago necessarily belongs. That definition doesn't belong in the kind of economy we're talking about. In fact, it significantly undermines the economy we're talking about. But I think it's, as we know, all industries transform, all businesses can transform. Things move, things change quickly. We think change happens slow. It happens slow and then it happens fast. Tipping points are at about 25%. These things can move quickly. As soon as we start building a proof of concept, that new economy has to come. It will come.
Yeah, that's so good. That leads really nicely into the second question, which is about speed of change, actually. So this is from Philip Tutt saying, Doughnut Economics is radical, as are many of us on the call, yet most of our established business clients like to evolve slowly. How does a well-entrenched business evolve fast enough to sit in the space you've outlined?
Yeah, really, I mean, tough question. I don't have any magic bullets on this stuff. And I think there are people on this call that would have better answers. But overall, I think we all know where the boundaries are, how we can push new ideas. And I think if there's one concept that maybe came out of what I was talking about, it's that let's not just celebrate the actions of companies. Let's think about the structural aspects of change that need to accompany this. Because there's some good things that happen everywhere, right? And we can promote it, we can talk about it, we can celebrate it, we can feel good for a moment. But if we're going to get to a point where systematically and systemically change is sweeping through, then it means we're going to have to bring some structural change into the mix. And I think the meaningful part of structural change is in this deep design of business. So see how you can open up that conversation. And there might be sort of nice ways to actually promote where there is an aspect of deep design that is helpful in the company, or you might be able to put ideas on the table and start moving the conversation with consumers around what's possible and what's useful here. But I would sort of focus on aspects of structural change, even if they feel very long term, or even if they feel like they are stepping stones towards more fundamental structural change. And we've got actually across that, if you open up the tools link I put into the chat on the Doughnut Design for Business, we've got some suggestions there for how a professional services company, in fact, all the way through the tool, we've got two case studies that kind of go through, one for a products company and one for a professional services company. There's loads of ideas there for how they can evolve and how their relationship with clients can evolve as well.
That's really good, because there is people asking about how practically they can kind of help change happen. So another question here saying, where's it gone? Most of us on this call agree and believe with everything you've said. It makes total sense, but how can we drive the change required when we're not leaders ourselves and leadership don't agree and believe? How can we use our collective power to drive the change? So I guess some of the things you've just touched on with the toolkit, but also opening up conversations. But any other advice or case studies of where change has come from maybe more of a sort of not grassroots level, but like lower down in the organization, or that kind of collective power has led to change?
Sure. I mean, Lisa, so there's a few that jump out for me. One is talking actively about how the design of the business holds back ideas, just internally, whichever space is, safe enough to do this, whether it's internally, externally with colleagues, just being clear that, look, if that is our sales target, or that is our market share target, or if that is the margin requirements, this means we can't work with this particular kind of client. This means that we're going to have to push this sort of practice. I think being very clear about the trade-offs here. One of the great disservices we've done over the last sort of 20 years of sustainability, and I've been in one form or another involved in this, is that we avoided the uncomfortable conversations around trade-offs. We avoided the fact that actually there are design features here that hold back some of the most meaningful change. So just bringing that out into the open and saying, look, this is the stuff we need to put on the table, and figuring out ways that, colleagues can have that conversation. And it need not be in the most confronting way. It need not be in a way that makes, senior management immediately uncomfortable. But putting those ideas on the table and saying, look, we'd like to see an evolution of this sector. I'm going to read just a couple of things from the tool that I shared around what a professional services company could do. For instance, it could look at, staff bonuses where they've achieved the most social and ecological impact. It could discontinue work with the most unethical clients. It can have a lower fee for the highest positive impact, for instance. It can have an open source methodology on ideas and models and frameworks it's created that can be shared more broadly. Think of the Houdini example I promoted. It could promote business redesign among its clients. It could promote aspects of these ideas among clients. It could share part of its revenue with communities. It can advocate for strong regulation of client industries. These are all some of the things that it can do. So slide 30, if anyone's in the link, I'll put the link again into the chat, but slide 30 of the tool actually has got some of those ideas. And then later on, if you work through it, there are ways that a professional services company might evolve its own design, bringing different stakeholders onto its own board, starting to have different financial parameters within there. And here we're in this exciting zone of, what does this industry look like? What do the businesses within this industry look like to belong to that future economy?
That's so interesting. There's some people asking about money, obviously the finance, the investment, and how that flows kind of through the business. So a question from Edward Bass. So to what degree are businesses adopting regenerative practices seeing investment, and what are the barriers to this right now? So where is the money flowing into kind of this new sort of future economy, and how are we seeing that sort of grow? And then actually somebody else I've just seen in the chat talking about, like, how can we be involved in repositioning the balance of power and influence away from the finance agenda in business and society to create this regenerative and distributive economy? So, like, yeah, how does the money flow into this? Where's the investment coming from? And is this new future economy, getting the investment that it deserves?
Well, I mean, one of the great advantages of professional services is that it's not necessarily capital intensive. You don't need $1 billion to retrofit a factory, to transform. Its value, its asset base is its talent. So there is this amazing ability actually to pivot that without having to have this. I talk to companies that are saying, to have my factory behave like a forest, I need this level of phenomenal investment. How am I going to do that? The impact investment funds that are out there, or the social finance funds out there, are not going to be enough. And they're really struggling. They're trying to figure out, how do I have hybrid financial models, and how do I mix debt with equity to bring this in, to transition to a big model and transition my own ownership and governance model. I think in professional services that there's a potential advantage, but I think more broadly in the economy, yes, there are bits and pieces of the current financial system that deal with this, that are moving in this direction. But overall, we're going to have to redesign our financial system. I know this sounds scary. This sounds really scary to start thinking, what does it look like? But if we genuinely think that, in the year 2050, in an economy that works for everybody on our planet, and we're going to have the same ridiculous financial system of short-termism, of focus on greed, focus on extraction, the game playing, the aggression, that isn't really inherently part of the majority of society, but a financial system that has emerged out of it, then I think we're wrong. We're going to have to evolve that as well. But in the short to medium term, there are options. There's various community-based organizations, there's impact investment, etc., that make some of this possible. But where you don't need a massive amount of external finance, I think maybe that's where we can be most ambitious.
That's amazing. I've just got two other quick questions, if you're okay for time. Erinch, I know we want to allow people to go into breakout rooms as well. So one around measurement. So two people talking about this. So the donut isn't an easily comparable thing like GDP. So what's the easier way to use a kind of measurement system? And then Maria de Faraggio asking, how do you know and measure that you're within the donut limits? So what are the metrics that are being used? And then also, how is that comparable to GDP, or how will we start to kind of see things that are comparable across, I guess, countries, businesses, organizations like GDP?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I get a version of this question in just about every talk or workshop I do. And essentially, there are really good frameworks out there for, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development has one, the Global Impact Investing Network has an impact framework. There are loads of ones, B Labs has got a B impact assessment framework. There's lots of different ways of assessing, is a company doing enough? Is it sufficient? Is it meeting its obligations? The donut doesn't work that way for companies. The donut's for people. It's for, human settlements. It's where we all have an equal right. I can't look at Coca-Cola and say, what is the right amount of biodiversity loss that Coca-Cola should be afforded? How does that relate to a smaller, newer startup, social enterprise that's in the same industry? And what percentage should they get? And what about the relationship between the ecological and the social impact? Trying to quantify these things is a fairly artificial process. It's happening in carbon and climate. The Science-Based Target Initiative does this for that. That's by far the most quantifiable thing, because it's the only thing in the world where a bit of carbon in Brazil is the same thing as a bit of carbon here. So we can quantify everything. But even there are some issues to unpack around grandfathering, which essentially says if you're massive and you've been emitting lots of carbon previously, you get to emit much more than someone who hasn't emitted much carbon previously. So it sort of rewards those that have been the biggest polluters. So there's huge methodological considerations that need to be worked through more broadly. It's a useful tool, it's helpful, but I think our ambition is to take the donut and say to companies, not what is the least that they should do, but how would you redesign yourself to pursue the most ambitious thing you could do? What is the most you could do? And how do you keep pushing to do more and more and more, rather than how do we get to a target? We found that as an entry point into far more transformative change. But of course, there are fantastic frameworks out there that are helpful for impact measurement, for materiality assessments, that you could Google and find very easily. We're not another one of those where we're trying to pivot the conversation to the next level of deep design transformation.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I think we would completely concur, like what's the most you can do, not what's the least you can do. That's what radical change means. last question, which is just a clarification question from somebody really, like, what's the relationship between doughnut economics and degrowth? So do we need to champion degrowth, and if so, how best is that going to happen? Do we tackle it head on and get people to go directly against growth ambition that's been heralded for so long, or is there a more subtle way to achieve that's more likely to gain engagement and less directly threatening to people? That's from Simon Garnett.
I mean, we are agnostic to growth. It almost feels ridiculous to focus on a figure that's meant to act as a proxy for social and environmental benefit. So if we just put growth more or less aside, like, who cares? Like, are we achieving the social outcomes? Are we achieving the ecological outcomes? And if we're doing those at a broader social level, which is inherently measurable, we can do that. We can do country donuts, we can do city donuts. Then we're on the right track. And to boil it down and say all of that, all of the donut is essentially measured through growth, or all of the aspects of what we need from our economy is measured through growth and consumption, is, I think, a fallacy. I mean, we have a skepticism towards growth as a focus, not just because it seems a little bit ridiculous, but also it distracts from what needs to happen. You know, if we look at the actual decisions that need to happen, and historically, it hasn't worked out for us. It's actually fueled the transgression of our planet's boundaries, and it hasn't helped anywhere near sufficiently to get people off the ground. There are countries that on paper have grown, but because of huge inequality, actually the amount of people in poverty hasn't declined at all. There are places that have grown phenomenally and been celebrated, but we've seen huge transgression of planet's boundaries. We haven't seen a positive relationship between the outcomes that we need to survive on this planet and keep a stable Earth system, our living planet remaining stable for us, and the outcomes of growth. But regardless of that, it almost feels we're agnostic to it. Let's just put it aside and measure what actually matters and pursue that, rather than some proxy that clearly doesn't represent what's needed.
Yeah, I love that. Focus on something new. Great. Thank you very much, Erinch. Amy, I'll pass back over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have you with us. And yeah, great questioning, Lisa. Thank you as well. So the next part of the session, Erinch, if you want to jump off now, feel free, because I know you, so goodbye. Wave goodbye.
Thanks, guys, and sorry I didn't get to answer all the questions. I see great ones in the chat, but looking forward to crossing paths again.
Bye. Thank you. So for this next bit of the session, we're not actually going to do breakout rooms, but what we're going to do is just open up the discussion. So Jonathan, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on this bit now. So we've just kind of doing a bit of a PD
Sure.
part.
Yeah. I mean, wow. I mean, that was amazing. You said, and it's so wonderful just to hear, like, just a big thinker sharing big thoughts that is gaining traction all around the world. And just then, I guess the question that we want to do now is ask you a question just to kind of all privately reflect on. And it's a kind of like an integration question, really, like to help us individually sense make out of what we've just heard and felt in terms of the talk, and then the questions and the responses. So the question is, so we're going to give you just 90 seconds or so, just to individually just breathe, just take a moment and just kind of give yourself the permission just to kind of sense make out of what you've just heard, and just process and come up with your own thoughts. That's why we want to do it in private rather than just perhaps listening to the loudest voices first. So just everybody gets the opportunity just to process for themselves. And so the question we have is, like, given everything you felt and heard, how would the advertising industry need to change in order to help everyone live within the donut? Okay, Amy, if you just want to drop that in the chat as well. But given everything you felt and heard, how would the advertising industry need to change in order to help everyone live within the donut? Okay. So yeah, just give yourself sort of 90 seconds, well, maybe 2 minutes. It's quite a chunky question, actually, just to have a think about like how you would respond to that as a question. And then what we'll do is we'll come back and we'll just kind of hear from voices in plenary in response to that, because then we can kind of access the wisdom of the crowd and kind of accelerate our own understanding of how donut economics could be applied within the industry that we are working. So enjoy some quiet time. Another 20 seconds or so. Great. That was just over 2 minutes. So, to the question, who would like to share some thoughts on that? Given everything you've felt and heard, how would the advertising industry need to change in order to help everyone live within the donut? All all responses are welcome. Everything from not at all to total, whatever. Laura Wade's got a cheeky smile on her face. Look at that.
Well, it might be, it's probably a rubbish idea, but I feel like big thing that I think, like to someone else's point about the leaders and the old guard, is that we're so sort of indoctrinated to growth. So if we were going to be radical, it'd be interesting if we were to report and be accountable on how we are driving the reduction of consumption. Because I know, like, so for how you're like the 70% reduction in the UK that's required, it'd be really interesting to, being radical, be targeted against that change and that consumer behavior in a measurable way, but that be part of the metrics to attract sort of shareholder investment that really want to see us survive in a net zero world and that kind of stuff. So that's where I started to go with that.
Great. Just so everybody's clear, so Laura is referring there to a report that was done by the Hot or Cool Institute, which is supported by UNEP. They, very similar to Doughnut Economics, they produced a report which was looking about a fair consumption space for all. And they concluded that in the UK, that we would need to reduce our consumption-related emissions by 70% by 2030, which is a way, I guess, of going from going below the ceiling. So that's what she's referring to. Thanks, Laura.
That's okay. Well, that's thanks. So you'll have to come to all my talks and do the footnotes of all my sources.
I'll always be your wingman, Laura. Who else would like to share their response to that question?
Simon had a raised hand. Simon, if
Simon, sorry, yes.
No worries. So first thing I should say is I'm not in the ad industry. I'm an adjunct to the ad industry, so I'm the kind of insight person. Some people will know because I bang on about this all the time, but for me, I do feel really fundamentally we need to reprogram our relationship with new. And I don't think it's necessarily just reprogramming our relationship with consumerism, because that for me is a very broad thing to say. And I heard you guys on the podcast the other day kind of talking about, well, you know, can't solve a problem by starting from the same thing. So green consumerism is a direct swap for consumerism. But I do wonder that I would love to just see us, you know, the industry has spent so long telling us that new is what makes us whole. You know, that it contributes to our identity, our success, our relationships, new. And I would love if we break that. It feels to me like an unbelievably unhealthy relationship we have with new. And I would love to get to a place where we talk about new to us rather than new to the world, maybe as one way in which we start to do that. Sorry, my wife just told me I've stolen her line, which is pretty sure that is her line. But, you know, TM, I heard it from Kathy. Shit, that's always the problem with having my wife in the background, isn't it? She's like, I can't get away with anything now.
The theme of this is like everybody needs a wingman or wingwoman. That's what I'm getting on this.
Yeah, I don't mind that. We'll take that one. Yeah.
I love that. Like the new to me. You know, that's again like a really nice reframe of, you know, secondhand or vintage. Again, it's that using the creativity of language to be able to give us what we want, new, but in a way that serves people and planet. It's new to us.
And I also think, by the way, sorry, just a final thing. I think that doing that actually is the surreptitious, subtle way that actually drives down our total consumption.
Yeah.
Because once you start doing that, you realize that actually you don't need as much as you think you do. But going out and telling people, as well, was my degrowth question, because I just think that that's such a confrontational message. And I wonder whether a don't consume is too confrontational, but a new to me is a less confrontational way with the same end.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. And also great understanding and insight of what will go and what will work and what won't work. So yeah, so thank you. Sandra.
Hi guys, how are you doing? I actually work for a branding agency, so my lens is slightly different, same world pretty much, but slightly different lens. And building on that last point, actually, it's about increasing the desirability of brands that regenerate, like, you know, and maybe setting targets within your organization in the short term to sponsor and support those kinds of businesses and build those kind of brands, because that's ultimately at the core of this. We need to make those brands as desirable, as luxurious, as, you know, as delectable as the brands that don't do that, so that, you know, you can win the war, because that's the consumer behavior that's ultimately, you know, going to change things. But then I started thinking it through, going, okay, well, that's all lovely. We know that those brands aren't as profitable. So how do we get paid? Because we still need to earn money. We need to live. And I did find myself going down the quagmire of like, how do we, you know, because we all need to get paid and we all need to live. But so like, what's the, you know, I don't have the answer for the model of like how you, you know, how you support those businesses, accepting that they won't have as much money to pay you, and you support your, you know, you become part of that. So anyway, I don't know the answer, but I've got the beginning of it.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. Karen.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, really good point. Well made. Thank you, Sandra. That about the desirability of this new way of being, because one of my main points, I'm Dr. Karen Middleton. I'm a researcher on this topic at the moment at the University of Portsmouth. Is that one of my, you know, the key things that is one of the key things that's coming out to me is, how does the advertising industry change? How do we leverage our skills and our, you know, unique ability to operate in a, you know, how do we take those skills in a way that is going to lead to change? So it is around creating desirability, it's around persuasion, it's about understanding consumers, And the ad industry is in the privileged position of being in between the public and business and organizations. So the kind of meeting of minds. But the only thing I can think is that it won't, because I've been trying to think, are there business reasons? Are there going to be business reasons for making this change? And to what you've just said, Sandra, I think it's not going to be about money. So it's that kind of thing has to be abandoned, you know, and from that point of view, it needs to be about advocacy and individual responsibility and just building those new values and feelings. And it is a case of leaving the old ways behind in some ways. So I can, that's the only way I can think that it can happen. Another thing that is really coming into my thinking is we've already got you know, the idea of brand having purpose, but that to date is only done in a meaningful way by a small number of businesses. So potentially that could be the way in to clients, is saying, you know, yes, you want to show that you've got brand purpose, but you can't, you know, it has to be meaningful. It has to involve this, this, and this. And that is about being educated and understanding about things like Doughnut Economics. This is the new way that business can operate. So kind of slowly filtering that in, but not too slowly because it's urgent.
Great. There's lots there. Thank you. And just the business model thing is something that Lisa's leading on, actually, about kind of alternative business models, because again, it's like, how does the industry make money if it's not an ROI based model based on driving growth and consumption? And that seems like that's a really good exam question. And the level of creativity that exists in the industry, you'd hope they'd be able to work that out. Because it's a hard question, but it's not that hard. It's just, you've got to make money in a different way, and businesses every day work out how to make money in different ways. So, I mean, there's lots of legacy stuff there, but, you know, fundamentally, how do we make money in a way that uses our talents and skills that is not based on driving loads of growth? I mean, say it like that, it's not that hard, really, is a question. So yeah, absolutely. And that's even introducing that as an idea, which is what Doughnut Economics does, at least opens up, like the open window, expands the window of what is needed in terms of the change that's happening at the moment. So yeah, so thank you. Edward.
Hello. This isn't a creative answer, I'm afraid. I really think, I'm not going to dance around it, I think addressing the relationship with clients and their demands is really, really important, and actually being brave on their behalf. I was delighted that I'm a freelance consultant, so I get to kind of plug in and work with agencies externally. And I was talking to an agency recently who was saying that they are looking into essentially enforcing their clients to sign up to the UN Sustainability Development Goals before allowing any work with them. And I was super impressed by that. I thought that was a really, really good standard to work by. You're going to lose some clients as a result, but ultimately they're going to be stranded assets long term anyway, so I'm not sure how much you'd want to generate a relationship with them. But yeah, very uncreative solution, but I just think holding them to account, and when you get that brief, being willing to turn it upside down or adjust it and say, well, can we bring this into account? I do think that these requirements are going to be increasingly added anyway, but anything the advertising industry and marketing industry and comms industry can do to kind of nudge it along would be really good.
Fantastic. And I think that it's not, I mean, sorry, you said it was an uncreative idea, but I think, it's so fascinating that the concept of saying no to a client or whatever is seen as like we say no to things every day, right? You know, so why is that such a revolutionary idea? I mean, I know it's like, you know, the money thing, but fundamentally it's like,
yeah, but it's not necessarily just no. I think it's just also saying, well, great, but you know, how about this? I've always found it amazing, and I think this has changed over the last kind of 30 years. If you go back to like the Saatchi and Saatchi kind of era of advertising, I think agencies had a lot more muscle in terms of being able to define briefs and turn briefs around. And maybe because of digital, maybe because of a few things. But I think, you know, I feel, especially big agencies that I've worked with, are a little bit gutless sometimes when it comes to doing that. I think it adds value, and I think it's a distinguishing factor. So I was so impressed with this agency. I'm not going to name drop, but yeah, I think some clients would at some level be really pleased that you're willing to be brave on their behalf. And I think those that wouldn't, do you want them long term anyway?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point, being more adult. Lizzie, and then we'll do Lizzie and then Julia, and then we'll have to wrap. So so thank you, Lizzie.
Hey everyone, I was coming in with a different point, but just to build on Ed's point, I think it's not just about being brave, like pushing your client to be brave. I think it's pushing honesty in these areas. So for example, just really simple example, if you are talking about the reduction of plastic, we've reduced our plastic consumption by X amount, but always pushing your client to say, well, what is your plastic consumption and what percentage of a fair share of the resource is this? And in this way, we are giving consumers a real honest perspective of what's going on in the world. I just think that's integral to it. And if we're really pushing the boundaries here of possibility, I think we also need to be asking ourselves, do we need as much advertising, or where can we reduce this? Like, because we're bombarded with adverts, all of us, like, as much as I love advertising, but you know, like, what's the average? 3,000 and something adverts people see a day? It's too much. So where can we reduce this? And if we're talking about reduction, then that's looking at, okay, so then what is the ROI targets that we're having when we're talking with clients? Because it can't just be about sales. It can't just be about reach. What are the new metrics that we're measuring? That's everything.
Fantastic. And you know, Erinch was very clear on what the metrics are, you know, above and below the boundaries. So thank you. Julia.
Thanks, Jonathan. I don't have the business model sorted, similar to what Sandra was saying, but a thought that came to mind was around the incredible skills of the advertising industry. I think advertising, if you boil it down really simply, is telling powerful stories that create action. What issues around society do we have today that require powerful stories to create action? You could look anywhere for this. You could look at what we need to do for sustainable living, what do we need to do to face into inequalities. The skill set of the advertising industry could be applied to so much more than the products of a brand, but actually there is still a role that brands can play in that storytelling. But it's how do we, I guess, tap into this incredible community to create the action that is so desperately needed through the storytelling that you guys know how to do.
I love that. I love it when people kind of, like, you give a definition of what the industry does that isn't about driving growth and consumption. And I think that's the pivot. Absolutely, it's like the pivot. So thank you. Yeah, it's really good. I'm going to pass to Amy in a second, but there's a very punchy response in the chat from Donald. Hello, Donald. Basically, in response to the question, he's written, the industry will shrink and disappear. It should only advertise what benefits or is within the donut, but deciding what is or what that is or isn't shouldn't be the remit of the industry. It should be regulated better. We are not the moral arbiters, which we're not good at, which is a pretty punchy and clear response. So thanks very much for that, Donald. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful questions. Really, really good. I'll pass you back to Amy. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, amazing. Great conversation. Really, really rich and insightful. So yeah, just a minute of closing, really. Like, thanks everyone for joining. It's been absolutely amazing. Really appreciate your time, your thoughts, your energy. It gives us life at PD. So thank you so much. Just some, if you want to kind of hear more about us or get involved in any of our projects, I'm sure most of you are probably on our mailing list or follow us on social, but I'm just going to drop in a link so you can just sign up if you aren't already. And then I have a final plug really for our Change the Brief Alliance training course. So like the first kind of step to making a difference is through the work that we put into the world. And our Change the Brief Alliance training course helps people who work in marketing, comms, advertising, PR, even brands are kind of signing up now. It's an amazing deep dive into the climate and ecological crisis, and it really hones in on how you can make a difference in your work that you put into the world. So I'm going to just drop a link for that in the chat as well, and then leave that with you. And basically, thank you everyone so much for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful evening and see you next time.